On a late-night transatlantic flight, a woman sitting quietly in first class sends the entire crew into a panic. Not because she's causing a ruckus, but because her challenger has no idea what kind of storm he's just unleashed. Join me as we enter this story where hidden power and cold justice collide amid dark clouds. Rain poured down outside the windows of London's Heathrow Airport. Droplets rolled down the glass, reflecting the dim lights of the runway. The night was chilly, but the air in the boarding area was warm and bustling. Elise Moreau stepped through the doors to board the late-night flight to New York, her high heels clicking steadily on the metal floor. Her beige trench coat hugged her body, her dark hair pulled back, revealing sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. She held a small leather bag in her hand, and her gaze swept over the crowd of passengers with an unusual calm. She stepped into first class, where soft overhead lighting illuminated the spacious leather seats. A businessman in a gray suit glanced at her, then quickly returned to his laptop. An older couple murmured something, but Elise paid no attention. She put her bag in the overhead bin, sat down in the window seat, and opened her iPad. Slender fingers moved across the screen, opening a dense document. Outside, through the window, raindrops continued to fall, mingling with the roar of the plane's engines. Elise's lips curled into a secret smile, as if she knew something no one else on the flight expected. The loudspeaker blared, announcing that the flight had taken off. The plane shook slightly as it passed through the thick clouds, the lights outside the windows gradually dimming. Victor Lange, a veteran flight attendant with over a decade of experience, entered the first-class cabin. His dark blue uniform was neatly pressed, but his sharp eyes revealed an arrogance that was hard to hide. He passed each passenger, checking tickets with a quick motion until he stopped by Elise's seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," Victor's voice came, polite but doubtful. "May I see your ticket?" Elise raised her head, her deep brown eyes meeting his. She smiled slightly, took her phone from her pocket, opened her e-ticket, and held it out. Victor took it, scrolling through the screen at an unnaturally slow pace. "First class, seat 3A, he muttered, as if searching for a non-existent mistake. He handed the phone back, but his lips pressed together, his gaze moving from her high heels to her expensive coat. Without another word, he turned away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the aisle. Elise shrugged, returning to her iPad. But in the distance, Victor stopped near the galley, whispering something to a colleague, his eyes glancing at her suspiciously. A cold breeze from the air conditioning blew past, foreboding. The plane steadied at 30,000 feet, the engine hummed a steady, monotonous soundtrack. Victor turned, this time with a more stoic expression. He stood right next to Elise's seat, his arms crossed over his chest, his voice cold as ice. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been an error in the reservation system," he said, not bothering to meet her eyes. "I need you to move to economy now." Elise looked up, eyebrows raised. "Reservation error?" Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that could not be ignored. "My ticket was confirmed 3 weeks ago. Could you double-check?" Victor clenched his fists, his eyes darkening. "I've checked. This chair is not suitable for you. Please stand up or I'll have to call security." The air in first class suddenly became heavy. A few passengers turned their heads, whispering to each other. Elise took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with anger, but she quickly controlled it. "If you're sure," she said, her voice light as air, but sharp as a knife. She stood, took down her leather bag, and followed Victor down the narrow aisle to economy. A murmur spread. A man in a suit shook his head. A woman covered her mouth and chuckled. Elise held her head high, but the hand clutching the strap of her bag suggested she was not as calm as she appeared. Victor led her to a middle seat in the crowded, noisy economy cabin, then turned away without another word. Elise sat down, looking out the darkened window. A storm was brewing outside, and so was her heart. The economy cabin was filled with chatter and the cry of a child in the back row. Elise set her bag on the floor and pulled out her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, sending a text, "Checking in. I'll signal if needed." She pressed send, then made a quick call. Her voice was low but sharp, ringing out through the surrounding noise. "Prepare. But don't act yet. I want everything clear." She hung up, her eyes sweeping across the cabin, stopping at Victor's figure in the distance. A middle-aged man sitting next to her, wearing a gray beanie, whispered, That stewardess was a jerk. Are you okay? Elise turned, smiling faintly. Thanks, I'm fine. Just a little trouble. But her eyes said otherwise. This was no small matter, and she wasn't about to let it go. Outside the window, lightning flashed between the dark clouds. Elise curled her lips, a cold smile flashing across her face. Lena Brooks, a young flight attendant with a warm smile, walked up to Elise. She wore the same blue uniform as Victor, but her eyes were as gentle as the sunlight in the dark night. Ma'am, do you need anything? Water or a blanket? Lena asked, her voice sincere. Elise looked up, a rare smile on her lips. Just water, thank you. Lena nodded, turned back to the galley, and a few minutes later brought a cool glass of water and placed it on a tray in front of Elise. If you need anything else, just call me, Lena said, and left with a light gait. In first class, Victor leaned against the galley, a cup of coffee in hand. He smirked at Daniel, another flight attendant. It's all right. She doesn't belong there, he said, triumphant. Daniel shrugged, not answering, but his eyes flickered with annoyance. Elise sipped her water, her eyes distant. She knew Victor thought he had won, but the game had only just begun. The flight was halfway through, the steady hum of the engines mingling with the rain pounding on the fuselage. Daniel walked over to Victor, handing him a phone from the crew. Operations, Daniel said, his voice dry. Victor frowned and picked up the phone. Hello, this is Victor Lange, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. On the other end of the line, a deep, icy male voice said, We have a complaint from a first-class passenger. What did you do to Miss Moreau? Victor stammered, I just followed my intuition. It seems she's not suited for first class. The voice interrupted. Intuition? Her ticket is valid. You have no right to transfer her. Prepare a detailed report when you land. Don't do anything stupid again. The call ended, and Victor stood still, his hands shaking. In economy, Elise sent a new text. Go. She put her phone down, her eyes flashing dangerously. Outside, thunder rumbled, a warning of what was to come. The intercom suddenly blared. Victor Lange to the cockpit. The captain's voice was hard and emotionless. Victor swallowed, walking heavily across the aisle. The passengers watched, curious. In the cockpit, the captain, a tall man with silver hair, turned to look at Victor. You've caused a big problem, he said, his voice as deep as a rock. The board is watching. Miss Moreau is no ordinary person. You'll face the consequences when you land. Victor paled, sweat rolling down his forehead. But, He didn't finish because the captain's eyes made it clear. There was no room for excuses. Victor stepped forward, his hands clenched, his heart filled with panic. In economy, Elise looked up through the window. Another flash of lightning lit her face. She smiled, not triumphantly, but with cold certainty. Victor, now without any arrogance, stepped down into the economy class with a glass of water in his hand. He stood before Elise, his voice trembling. Miss Moreau, I'm sorry. I must have made a mistake. You can go back to first class if you want. The cabin fell strangely silent. All eyes were on them. Elise raised her head, looking Victor straight in the eye. Thank you, she said, her voice light as air but sharp as a knife. But I think this place is more in keeping with how you see me. A soft chuckle came from the back seat. Victor blushed, his hands shaking so much that he spilled a few drops of water on the floor. I didn't mean to, he stammered, but Elise had already turned away, not bothering to reply. The surrounding passengers began to whisper. A few snickered. Victor turned and hurried back to the galley, his heart burning with shame. Elise took out her phone and texted one last time. Make sure they check the security cameras. She put down the phone, took a sip of water, her eyes cold as ice. The plane landed at JFK Airport in New York, with the rain still falling steadily. Passengers stood up and took their luggage, but the air was still heavy. 2 security guards in black uniforms boarded the plane, their cold eyes scanning the cabin. Victor Lange? Someone asked. Victor stood at the end of the aisle, nodding weakly. Come with us. There's a matter to investigate. He was led away, head bowed, as the passengers murmured. Elise stood up, put on her trench coat, and walked out with a leisurely gait. She picked up her phone and made a short call. Send me a report when you're done. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. She hung up, walked through the airport doors, and into the New York night. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still dark, as if witnessing a storm just passing through. A week later, at the airline's Manhattan headquarters, Elise sat across from Richard Hale, the CEO. He, a middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit, bowed slightly. "Miss Moreau, I apologize for what happened. This is unacceptable. We will reform our policies, starting with retraining the entire crew." Elise nodded, her voice cold but firm. "I hope you keep your word." Victor, after the hearing, was fired. A few days later, he sent an email to Elise, his words trembling. "Miss Moreau, I apologize. I was wrong to judge you based on prejudice. It cost me dearly, but I deserved it." The airline announced an anti-discrimination training program, and Elise's name was mentioned as an indirect inspiration. Lena Brooks, a kind young flight attendant, was promoted to team leader, her smile lighting up the press conference. Elise stood by her office window, looking out at the bright lights of New York, her lips curled into a smile. The storm had passed, but her power remained, silent and unstoppable.